It is a cloudy winter morning in Paris when citizen Louis Capet is escorted to the center of the Place de la Révolution. Not so long ago, he had not just been citizen Louis Capet, but King Louis XVI, chosen by God to rule over the Kingdom of France. His people, however, had enough of kings and their supposed divine rights. His end would be one of a common citizen with no distinction from a common criminal. It would be an execution for everyone. His request to delay the execution to prepare himself for death and to spend time with his family had been denied. So were his requests to keep his hands free during the execution or to keep his hair long. Now he walks to the scaffold with a steady step and upright posture. When he arrives at the scaffold, he tries to give a speech. This attempt, however, is quickly drowned by the 60 drums of the soldiers surrounding the scaffold. He was promptly manhandled onto the horizontal wooden plank and his neck secured in the brace. A few seconds later, shockingly, deliberately and disappointingly quickly, it was over. Initially, the French Revolution was well received by Europe's intellectual enlightened elites for its humanitarian ideals. By summer of 1793, however, any such ideals were just the veneer of a ruthless regime of terror. The previous revolutionary government under Rousseau had been violently removed from power in an armed insurrection. The strings of government now lie in the hands of the radical Jacobin faction in France headed by the notorious Maximilien Robespierre. Almost all the revolution's initial leaders were sent to the guillotine. So was anyone expected or accused of conspiring against the revolution. Rivers of blood flowed from the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution as daily dozens of heads were being severed. The scaffold had to even be moved away from the Place de la Révolution because the blood threatened to contaminate the city's water supply. Across France, regions rose in rebellion against the Jacobin madness. In France's Vendée region, a particularly strong rebellion had already been going since 1792. Here, contrary to the rest of France, the nobility was still living among the peasants in the countryside. The strictly Catholic peasants and the lords hated everything the revolution stood for. The ferocity of the Republic's response to the Vendée uprising was extraordinary by any standard. Soldiers burned villages and corpses and killed 117,000 people. Mass executions with grape shot and collective drownings were among the creative ways of genocide. In one instance, 2 women and 30 children were buried alive in a huge pit. This regime of terror was not only fighting internal enemies, but also most of the great powers of Europe. Since 1792, the Republic had been at war with Austria for the supposed support of French royalists. The initial attack on the Austrian Netherlands just to the north of France failed miserably. With most French officers being aristocrats, the majority of them had already left the country. Those that remained were of dubious loyalty. The Revolutionary Army, however, was quick to adapt. Reforms were quickly introduced and tactics simplified to match the skills of the new recruits. The newly reformed army turned the tide around at the Battle of Valmy in September of 1792 and went to invade the Austrian Netherlands. This raised the ire of the British as the Netherlands were strategically important for them. The murder of the king and the subsequent terror had already turned public sentiments against the French. Thus, just a few days after Louis's execution, France preemptively declared war on Britain and her ally, the Dutch Republic. Shortly after, Spain and several Italian states joined the Allies. This presented the French Republic with a new challenge. What was previously a land war in Europe had spiraled into a naval and colonial war. While the French army was quickly able to overcome its initial shortcomings, the navy was still struggling massively. The British Royal Navy was now also directly supporting the Vendée Rebellion. The French Navy had always been associated with royal power, and just as in the army, all of its officers were aristocrats. Most of them resigned their commands after the revolution, and only 2 vice admirals and 3 rear admirals from the initial 18 remained. To quickly replace them, the officer corps was opened to commoners, and remaining old officers were quickly promoted. Many merchant captains also took command of several ships. The navy at its 2 main bases in Toulon and Brest had always been at loggerheads with the local authorities over usage of resources and port facilities. With no authority to turn to, the French Navy was at the mercy of local politicians. In Toulon, the commander of the Mediterranean fleet was even arrested by civil authorities. French sailors also despised the hated class recruiting system in the French Navy, in which every coastal region had to provide the Navy with a certain number of men. Living conditions aboard the Navy ships were unbearably hard. Sailors generally weren't paid since the Navy was still in debt from the War of American Independence. Hygienic conditions on the ships were nightmarish as the men were cramped into the ships for days on end, rarely washing. Scurvy was also a major problem as the French Navy did not adapt the British practice of drinking lime juice and sauerkraut to prevent it. Discipline was harsh and punishments were draconian. One especially brutal punishment was the so-called call. Here the poor sailor would be stringed head down to a mast of a sailing ship with his head dropped down into the water as the ship rolled along, akin to what we today call waterboarding. Considering these conditions, the Navy was fertile ground for revolutionary ideals. Thus the sailors of the French Navy had both inspiration and reason for mutiny. Ignoring the desperate state of the French Navy at Brest, France's governing body, the infamous Committee of Public Safety, ordered the fleet at Brest under Vice Admiral Mourad de Galais out into Quiberon Bay to prevent British supplies from reaching the rebellious Vendée. 2 squadrons were sent out, one headed by the Admiral himself and the other by Captain Duval. A storm quickly forced both squadrons to retreat into Brest. Captain Duval was even killed during the storm by a loose block which his sailors hiding below deck refused to fix, so he tried to fix it himself. Later that month the fleet departed again. Trust between men and officers was at an all-time low. Just before the Brest fleet departed, bad news trickled in from France's Mediterranean fleet in the south. Royalist conspirators and moderate revolutionaries had taken over the city of Toulon in an open rebellion against Robespierre and his regime. Fearing they might get the same treatment as the Vendée, they made a pact with the devil. They invited the British Royal Navy under Admiral Howe into the city and handed over the entire Mediterranean fleet. This was seen as the ultimate betrayal by French sailors in the Brest squadron, which was now out in Quiberon Bay. They no longer trusted their mostly aristocrat officers. Tensions were at a boiling point. The officers found it increasingly difficult to maintain authority over their men. With the Brest fleet now out in Quiberon Bay, conditions worsened every passing day. Bad rationing aboard the ships led to mass cases of scurvy and malnutrition. Tensions between officers and men soon escalated into open mutiny. The men demanded to immediately return to Brest. Only a few captains managed to keep control over their men. One such ship was the Trajan, headed by Captain Joyeuse de Villaret, who would be promoted to Rear Admiral the following year. This was yet another embarrassment for the Navy. 2 months later, the rebellious Toulon was recaptured thanks to the efforts of a young Corsican artillery officer by the name of Napoleone di Buonaparte. The British left many scuttled ships behind and burned all the supplies of seasoned timber. Although the mutiny had demonstrated the sailors' revolutionary spirit, it went against the explicit wishes of the CPS. French naval power had been absolutely crippled by the Toulon surrender and the Brest mutiny. The CPS had to act. Only one CPS member, however, had any maritime experience whatsoever. Citizen Jean-Bon Saint-André had already served in the merchant navy and thus was the obvious choice to whip the navy back into shape. Arriving in Brest after an arduous journey over terrible roads connecting Paris to Brest, he had one clear mission, and that was to thoroughly purge the navy of supposed traitors. This, however, was both unpractical and impossible to do. A full-on Jacobin purge of the navy would have utterly crippled it, and many of the formerly royal officers had demonstrated great ability, such as Captain Joyeuse de Villaret. He used the Jacobin method of cruelty more selectively to reinforce discipline. The ringleaders of the mutinies were guillotined in front of their comrades and denounced as traitors to the patrie. Jean-Bon made these executions into masterpieces of his propagandistic abilities. From then on, French sailors' leisure time was taken up with relentless politicization, emphasizing unity, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Political speeches were held aboard ships' decks and revolutionary songs sung, all monitored closely by the classic Jacobin tools of terror and surveillance. He also renamed several ships to better match his revolutionary spirit. The massive 130-gun flagship L'Océan was renamed Le Montagne after the Montagnard politicians. Other names he came up with featured révolutionnaire or revolutionary, tyrannicide, tyrannicide, and juste, just. He also went to great lengths to revitalize Brest stockyards, which had been starved of material and workers. He was able to provide them with massive amounts of naval supplies in record time, for he had one major advantage unprecedented in any time before him: the power of requisitioning. Anything deemed necessary for the greater good of the French nation could be requisitioned by the state. Timbers were taken from farmers in places as far away as the Pyrenees and taken to fuel Jambon's war machine in the making. Men from coastal regions that had already been claimed by France's new conscription law, the levée en masse, were claimed by Jambon and his navy, alleviating the manpower shortage. Over the course of the winter, the crippled, mutinous, demoralized navy had been revitalized to again pose a challenge to the British Royal Navy cruising the horizons. In addition to revitalizing the navy, Jambon introduced harsh rules for his officers. Any captain who would haul down the national color would be executed. If the ship was at sea in such a situation, the crew was instructed to depose their captain and detain him for later execution if he tried to surrender. Furthermore, a new directive from Paris reached Jambon. The navy would be tasked with preparing a full-on invasion of Britain. No quarter was to be given to the British enemy. Tasked with facing the revitalized French enemy was the elderly war hero from the previous two wars, Sir Richard Howe. The 67-year-old Admiral of the fleet was a true veteran, having seen extensive action and having distinguished himself as a capable commander of large fleets in the American War of Independence. In the years between the wars, Howe molded his experience in fleet command into his own signal book. Owing to his popularity, the book was adopted by the Navy. Up to that point, the Navy didn't have any standardized signals. In 1793 he was recalled into service against his initial wishes by King George III personally. He was one of the few sea officers who had experience in fleet command, and thus this appointment was one of necessity. In fact, Howe once stated that no man older than 60 should ever take command at sea. It was also highly unusual for an old gentleman like him, who had already served as First Lord of the Admiralty, to be recalled into action. In fact, technically, it was a demotion. Only the king's repeated demands made him take over and accept command in 1793. The navy he would get back to in 1793 was the most powerful in the world, with its 115 ships of the line. On a rate-to-rate comparison, the British ships were smaller than their French counterparts. British ships, however, tended to be built sturdier and hold longer under fire. The British crews also enjoyed better training, more food, and overall better cleanliness and hygiene than their French counterparts. Despite this, the British Navy also had its problems. All ships in the Channel Fleet were undermanned with the exception of HMS Glory. Most ships were at roughly 85% strength, meaning that the massive British first rates were up to 100 men short, although this problem seems to have been worse or the same for the French. Gunnery practice also occurred irregularly and depended on the captain. Mostly combat experience was also not to be found among British sailors, as the last war was already long time ago. No one really knew how the British sailors would perform under French fire. Meanwhile in Paris, the situation for the revolutionary government was quickly improving. Both external and internal enemies had been pushed back and no longer posed an immediate threat on the revolution itself. The Vendée uprising had been squashed and Toulon retaken. The British army had been bested at Honchote and the Austrians at Wattignies. The existential threat to the CPS had subsided and was promptly replaced by infighting and factionalism. On the one side stood the Hébertists and the Enragés as representatives of the radical sans-culottes. They pressured the committee to take the terror on an even higher level. On the other side stood the Indulgence headed by the prominent Jacobin leader Georges Danton, who was known for his clemency even toward his bitterest enemies. Clemency, however, was in the eyes of Robespierre and his sans-culottes equal to treason. Those who were not with him were against him. In the spring of 1793, Danton and his followers were arrested. All of them were immediately sentenced to death. On the surface, Robespierre had secured his political position by eliminating his rivals. With executing one of the revolution's most important leaders in the eyes of the French people, he had gone too far. Robespierre knew he had to act to win the forgiveness of the French people. The people of France were not only enraged by this perfidious murder, but also by massive food shortages. A famine swept France in 1794, since many peasants were drafted away from the grain fields to fight and die on the battlefield. To procure food and to buy the forgiveness of the French people, Robespierre looked to America. Americans were deeply divided in their opinions about their sister republic across the pond. Initially, they had been very supportive of the French Revolution, in some cases even holding feasts in major cities to celebrate it. In one case in Charleston, a cheerful crowd even sang the Marseillaise. When news stories from the terror trickled in from across the Atlantic, opinions became more divided. The US government under George Washington, who was less supportive of the French, issued a neutrality declaration. Public opinion, however, in the US rapidly shifted in the favor of the French when a British Royal Navy squadron under Vice Admiral John Jarvis conquered France's Caribbean colonies of St. Lucia, Tobago and the immensely rich island of Martinique. After the conquest, the British embarked on a plundering spree to rival Napoleon and the Nazis. They staked claim to everything French, even property of royalist collaborators who had helped them seize the island in the first place. This blatant robbery committed against one of their most important trading partners sparked a public outcry in the USA. American merchants thus were all too eager to exchange their goods for French gold and silver. News of Robespierre's large order for food was quick to reach the other side of the Atlantic. Over the winter, a large convoy of merchants was assembling at Chesapeake Bay, ready to cross the Atlantic whenever an escort squadron arrived. By April, the fleet had grown to 156 merchantmen loaded with 67,000 barrels of flour, hides, bacon and salt beef, 7,163 barrels of sugar, cotton, cocoa, rice and indigo to boost France's war chest. The convoy valued over £1.5 million in total. The assembling of such a massive fleet didn't go unnoticed by the British. Word quickly spread amongst sailors, putting the British Royal Navy on high alert. Lord Howe, with the main part of the Channel Fleet, set out directly to blockade the Brest Atlantic Fleet, now under the command of the recently promoted Rear Admiral Joyeuse de Villaret. A smaller squadron of 6 ships of the line under Rear Admiral George Montagu was to cruise between Cape Ortegal and the latitude of Belle-Île in hopes of intercepting the convoy if it was headed for another port. Before Howe arrived at Brest, a squadron of 2 fast 74 gunners under Rear Admiral Van Stable left Brest with orders to meet the convoy and to shepherd it back to Europe. A second squadron of 5 fast ships of the line under Rear Admiral Neely had left Rochefort to meet the convoy at the predetermined points and to escort it safely into port. For the British, finding the convoy would prove difficult as the French coastline was massive. For Villaret and his French Atlantic Fleet, the situation became a nervous waiting game. Every day he scanned the horizon for friendly frigates with news of Van Stabel's convoy. Every sail he spotted, however, turned out to be an enemy frigate sailing deep into Brest harbor to count his ships. On the 21st of May, the British stranglehold over Brest got interrupted. Strong easterly winds forced Howe away from the Brest blockade. Following this, Jambon and Villaret received direct orders from Robespierre. They were to set out and bring the convoy home. This was as much of an order as it was a threat. Villaret knew that his head only rested upon his shoulders as long as he was to achieve this mission. This implied threat was amplified by Jambon's presence on the flagship Montagne when the fleet set out. Thick fog embedded Villaret's fleet as they made their way out of port. On their way, they passed Howe's squadron so closely that they could hear the British fog signals. Meanwhile, Van Stabel's convoy had left Chesapeake Bay on the 2nd of April. All French fleets were now converging on the predetermined meeting point. Like hungry sharks, Sir Montagu's ships were still patrolling the Bay of Biscay, still unaware where to find their prey. This changed on May 15th when Montagu intercepted the French warship Le Maire de Guiton with captured English merchantmen in tow. Under interrogation, the French captain revealed the meeting location of the two fleets 45 to 47 degrees north and 2 degrees west of Tenerife. Delighted at having extracted this vital information, Montagu sent a frigate under full sail to rush to Howe to inform him. When the frigate arrived at Howe's position, they found Howe looking for Villaret's fleet near Brest. After receiving the news, Howe quickly turned south. All the chess pieces of this intricate game were now converging on this one point in the middle of the Atlantic. It is a misty morning on May 28th. For days on end, Howe's signal lieutenant, Edward Cordington, had been scanning the horizon to await any signal from the frigates preceding the fleet. He was known for his exceptional sight and capacity for attention. He was so good at his job that he was required to stay awake for hours on end with very little sleep, and was even allowed to sleep in a dedicated chair on the quarterdeck of Howe's flagship, the Queen Charlotte. On this morning, however, his monotonous task suddenly became exciting when the forward signal frigate Phaeton started signaling to the flagship. Phaeton signaled to have seen 27 big sails belonging to a ship of the line, one frigate and one unidentifiable one, which later turned out to be a rasee. For Cordington, there was no doubt that this must be Villaret's main battle fleet. This assumption was indeed correct. Villaret had sighted Phaeton, but this apparently didn't alarm the French fleet. In fact, they initially thought her to be a stray frigate of either Van Stabel's convoy or Neely's squadron. This confusion can be partly explained by the lack of telescopes the French navy was plagued by. Thus the French set sail for HMS Phaeton in a loose, disorderly fashion. 3 hours after the initial sighting, the French fleet finally realized their mistake and hastily started preparing a line of battle. By that time, Phaeton was 3.5 miles away from the French and half a mile away from Howe's fleet. This gave Cordington finally the opportunity to count the enemy sails himself. The French turned out to have brought 26 ships of the line, the exact same number as the British. The French had brought 3 of their massive first rates, 4 heavy 80-gun third rates and 21 lighter 74-gun third rates. Howe's fleet included 2 first rates, including the flagship Queen Charlotte, 4 second rates, 2 80-gunners, including the Spanish-built HMS Gibraltar, built of tropical hardwood, and 16 74-gun third rates. This apparent balance of power was not particularly auspicious for the decisive engagement Howe hoped for. For Cordington and his crow's nest, the lacking of the seamanship of some French captains became apparent, as he witnessed the French fleet needing 3 hours to form a line of battle. During the whole process, the flagship Montagne sailed up and down the French line, with Villaret giving verbal instructions. Having the wind on their side, the French did not fear an immediate attack on their line, however. At 11:13 on that morning, Howe took the time to signal to his fleet, "The people may have time to eat." While the British were having their lunch, Villaret ordered his ships to turn their bows more into the wind, to lure Howe further away from the meeting point with the convoy. Seeing this maneuver, Howe ordered a general chase. The sailors' short meal was ended and they started clearing the decks to make the ships ready for combat. All the things needed in the sailors' everyday lives, such as hammocks, tables and other items, were removed from the decks to make space for the cannons. This was all happening as the fleet was chasing the French on a course very close to the wind, which made them heel considerably. Extremely high mid-Atlantic waves made the situation even more shaky and dangerous below decks, especially because one couldn't see the waves hitting the ships from below, which exposed the men to seemingly random heavy shaking below deck. One of the sailors' wives aboard HMS Tremendous used this stressful and dangerous moment to give birth to a child amidst the chaos. All men on both sides prepared psychologically for the upcoming hell that was seemingly about to break loose. From the French ships one could hear the occasional shouts of "Vive la République!". Slowly but surely the British managed to get close to the French rear. Rear Admiral Parsley of the HMS Bellerophon anticipated the French to soon turn about and to face the pursuing British, and thus decided to tack. At 2:30 PM, the rearmost French ship La Révolutionnaire suddenly turned about to fight. The Bellerophon, herself being a 74-gun third rate, was now somewhat isolated to face this massive 110-gun Goliath. La Révolutionnaire sent a devastating volley into Parsley's ship, severely damaging his hull and rigging. Howe, seeing this, signaled HMS Russell, Audacious, Thunderer, Leviathan and Marlborough to Parsley's assistance. In the 90 minutes it took for help to arrive, the two ships were locked in a devastating melee. Villaret, however, out of fear of getting his fleet caught, ignored the opportunity to potentially capture the hard-pressed Bellerophon and proceeded with his main fleet. Devastatingly crippled and dismasted by the larger Frenchman, the Bellerophon drifted downwind. The ships sent to assist her were now trickling in and started battering the abandoned Révolutionnaire. The British slowly but surely hammered the abandoned Frenchman into a standstill with sustained gunfire. Half an hour into the engagement, the French had lost their mizzenmast and several yards, as well as sustaining massive damage to the hull. Stubbornly, the Frenchmen still kept firing, severely damaging Audacious and Thunderer. After 2 more hours of grueling cannonade, the daylight was rapidly fading. By 9:50 PM, fire ceased, the French being reduced to a floating wreck and drifting. Captain Bertie of HMS Thunderer sailed up to the battered Frenchman to inquire if he had surrendered. Captain Van Dongen of La Révolutionnaire confirmed that he had surrendered. Bertie then wore his ship around to join back up with Howe and most importantly to repair his ship. He did, however, not put a prize crew on La Révolutionnaire, nor did he put her in tow. With night setting in, the French crew started repairs. The wind picked up and waves became even higher. The battered La Révolutionnaire used this to slowly drift apart from the British fleet, and she eventually managed to slip away, as she was in this stage way too battered to continue the fight. The French ship had endured 4 hours of ferocious fighting with 6 British ships, an extraordinary feat by any standard. The Jacobins at home, however, would have none of it. When Van Dongen and his officers arrived back home, these brave heroes were imprisoned. While the Révolutionnaire was slipping away, during the night the British remained, having anything but a good rest. Aboard the damaged ships, repairs kept sailors from getting any sleep. HMS Audacious was considered too damaged to continue the fight the next day and was ordered to make for home. A shimmer of daylight was already appearing beyond the horizon as Admiral Howe gave the signals to reform the battle line at 3:55 AM. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the signals were still visible in the first grey light of an Atlantic dawn. A strong and steady wind blew from the southwest and a heavy swell thumped against the ship's bows. Unlike the previous day, the French formed up quickly and well, having impressively maintained their cohesion during the blustery night. Their battle line was stretched out on the western horizon, sailing on a southerly course, close hauling the southwesterly wind with the British still miles to the east. Howe's challenge, therefore, was to engage the enemy from leeward, which was anything but an easy task. To achieve this, he had to sail ahead of the enemy, sailing on a parallel course and then to tack and cut their line. Slowly but surely, the British overtook the French van. At 7 AM, Howe decided they were far enough ahead and gave a signal to tack. Its fleet executed the maneuver masterfully, turning their ships one by one, forming a perfect line again. Though perfectly executed, Howe's maneuver was not perfectly judged. On the new course, the British fleet was only to hit the French rear, like they had done the day before. This time, however, Villaret did not want to sacrifice part of his fleet to escape. Thus, the French van was ordered to wear around to come to the rear's assistance. Now, for the first time on this journey, both fleets were approaching each other, ready for battle. First shots were exchanged at the center of the line at 10 AM. This long-range gunfire, however, was mostly ineffectual. This long-range artillery duel lasted 1.5 hours as the British tried to haul the wind closer in hopes of breaking the line at some point. At 11:27 AM, Howe ordered his ships to tack and break the line all at once. His captains, already in a fierce firefight, were unable to follow his orders and kept their course initially. Some of the captains, being unable to tack under fire, wore their ships around, losing even more wind against the enemy. HMS Queen and HMS Royal George, still wanting to press the attack, close-hauled their wind, but all they managed to achieve was to get stuck in between both fleets and coming under horrendous fire. Again, Howe signaled to his fleet to finally tack and cut the French line, but again his signals were ignored. After giving the signals 4 times in a row without effect, Howe took matters into his own hands and tacked with his flagship in the middle of the line, hoping that the entire line would follow. The maneuver was immediately followed by the ships next to Queen Charlotte, the flagship, HMS Bellerophon and Leviathan. It was a bold maneuver executed under heavy French fire. The other British ships followed the maneuver as best as they could, albeit far from simultaneously. Howe's flagship was still quite far away from the French line during the maneuver, but the British ships in the van were forced to run the gauntlet of several French broadsides. As they were executing the maneuver, the British were suddenly hit by a violent squall accompanied by thick mist and rain, during which no object could be distinguished at 100 yards distance. When the mist cleared, utter chaos unfolded in front of Howe's eyes. The entire fleet was horribly scattered, with hardly 2 ships being on the same tack. Had Villaret decided to take up the opportunity and to attack this scattered line, disaster could have transpired for Howe. Luckily for him, however, the French kept their formation, allowing the British to reform closer to the French. The now newly reformed British line tacked in good order, ready to strike again against the French rear. The cannonade between the 2 fleets became ever more effective as the British closed in. Howe with the Queen Charlotte came up to the French line, 6 ships from the rear ranging along the 74-gun Léon. Holding her fire, Queen Charlotte took a sharp turn and cut through the French line at Léon's stern. The massive guns of the giant first-rate opened fire on both ships on each side, tearing a trail of destruction through both of them. Shortly later, HMS Leviathan managed to cut in between Indomptable and Tyrannicide, isolating them. Other ships, however, struggled to pass through the line, as the French kept up an impressive cohesion. Again, the French rear was isolated, but again Villaret decided against abandoning it to the British. He hoisted the signal, "Who loves me, follows me," and wore his ship around. This example of bravery was too irresistible to ignore, and the whole French fleet followed suit. The dynamic of the exchange ahead suddenly shifted, with Howe's shattered flagship adrift, while the French in pristine condition were bearing down on his confused and damaged fleet. He could do nothing but watch as Villaret picked up his battered rearguard and shepherded it back to safety. No further engagement took place on the 29th, and the day concluded with a stalemate, with both sides busying themselves with repairs. No sleep was to be had for sailors on both sides, as hammocks were stored away, and as the noise of repairing the ships was to be heard everywhere. HMS Queen, which had been in thick fighting for the entire day, had her whole rigging replaced. On the French side, Indomptable, having been raked by Queen Charlotte, was considered too damaged to continue the fight the next day and was sent home to Brest. During the night, 3 more ships arrived from Neely's squadron, replacing the loss of Indomptable and Révolutionnaire. When darkness slowly subsided in the early morning hours of May 30th, Howe saw the French fleet downwind formed up in good order. As his fleet had taken the wind advantage the previous day, he now held the weather gauge. All sailors on both sides knew that this meant a full-scale British attack was forthcoming. Just as the British were closing the distance, a thick fog suddenly engulfed both fleets. This sudden appearance of fog immediately ended the British assault. Being unable to even see their own ships in the fog, both admirals scrambled to signal to their fleets to keep station via bells. Such situations were always dangerous for ships, as they could easily find themselves amidst the enemy fleet once the fog cleared. This nerve-wracking situation continued into the night and the next day. The morning of May 31st was spent by both admirals frantically searching their own fleets. At 1:45 PM, the fog finally cleared. Both fleets had impressively kept their station during the entire time. Howe immediately signaled to his fleet to group around his flagship, but to the surprise of the French, he kept his distance. The French sailors mistook this for cowardice, mocking the British. One British prisoner on one of the French ships remarked that the French should not that easily underestimate Howe. Howe was a veteran fleet commander and knew very well that should he engage now, a drawn-out battle could have lasted well into the night, something he wanted to avoid at all costs. Thus he decided to keep shadowing the French for the remainder of the day. In the early evening hours, Howe summoned 6 of his captains on his flagship and made clear his intentions of a night chase. It was a clear night with starlight shimmering on the waves. The British fleet kept their distance to the French, closely guarding their weather gauge and not letting the French escape. At 3:45 AM on June 1st, the first signals were hoisted on Queen Charlotte's mast in the grey dim of an Atlantic dawn. Howe had changed his formation so that the bigger ships matched the French ones with equal firepower. He knew that the French were not trying to run from a fight, since they had not been taking up the numerous opportunities to run, nor was Villaret trying to pull off any complicated offensive maneuvers either. The security of the French fleet rested in its cohesion, and both commanders knew it. His last signal was followed by the discharge of a signal gun, requiring all his captains to break through the enemy line. He then turned to his officers, saying, "And now, gentlemen, no more book, no more signals." His battle plan required for each British ship to break the French line individually, which was no mean logistical feat. His fully extended battle line was at least 2 miles long, and it was very hard to discern which opponent in the French line was whose. Before the attack was launched, time was made on both fleets for the men to eat. The meal for the sailors was horrible, as no stove had been lit on the ships since May 29th. All facilities to enjoy the food, such as benches and tables, had been stowed away as the ships were transformed into fighting platforms. The meal was less for the stomach than for the mind, to give the sailors something to complain about as they headed into the carnage that awaited them. Howe had went through the gun decks that morning, speaking words of encouragement to the gun crews. Enthusiasm was at an all-time high after 3 days of painful waiting. For the French, the atmosphere on board was a similar one, as the crew of the Gemap burst out in cheers of "Vive la Nation" and "Vive la République" as the British were finally approaching. When breakfast was done, the British edged ever closer to the French. Long-range gunfire started at 9:25 AM. Determinedly and quickly, the British fleet angled itself closer to the French line. The first British ship to courageously charge forward was Captain Gambier's defense. Gambier found a weak point between the 7th and the 8th French ships, Mucius and Tourville of the vanguard. Devastating raking fire ripped through the French ships as defense made her way through. Minutes later, Captain Berkeley of HMS Marlborough executed Howe's maneuver perfectly, raking and then entangling his ship with the Impetu. At the tip of the line, Caesar, Bellerophon and Leviathan failed to pierce the French line, ranging alongside their French counterparts. Vice Admiral Graves, leading the Van Division in HMS Royal George, misjudged the distance between him and the French line, raging alongside her opponent Terrible at some distance, suffering devastating fire from the French guns as she tried to close in. The battle began at the van, but the engagement soon spread to the very tips of both lines, and for the first time in these 5 days of sporadic engagement, the battle became general. Howe headed directly for Villaret's flagship, easily distinguishable by the full square French tricolour it hoisted. A mistake of the captain of the Jacobin astern of Villaret's Montagne opened the gap between the two ships. Withholding her fire, Queen Charlotte passed the Jacobin, sustaining her broadside before cutting across the Montagne's stern. When the gunners on the lower gun deck of Queen Charlotte saw the Montagne's rudder pass, they unleashed their deadly double-shotted salvos. Once the first shot has been fired, the British guns kept firing relentlessly, so that the barrels became red hot. After cutting the line, Queen Charlotte ranged alongside the Montagne, mercilessly battering her. Howe ordered to hoist more sail in order to keep up with the Montagne. The strain on her damaged rigging, however, was too great, making her main and fore topmasts get ripped away and blown into the sea. The ships ahead of Howe, however, only engaged the enemy at a distance, with the respective officers being criticized after the battle for this. Shortly after Howe's breakthrough, HMS Brunswick, trying to cut the line to assist Queen Charlotte, crashed into the Vainqueur de Peuple, getting stuck on her. Both ships, now locked into each other, point-blank volleyed each other's hulls to smithereens. In this extreme short-range gunfight, the superior British gunnery and hull strength slowly chewed away their French counterpart. In this fight, the Brunswick racked up the highest casualty list of any British ships in the battle, mainly by means of French sniper fire. Captain Harvey of the Brunswick was himself hit 3 times, losing the right hand to a musket ball, being hit on the back by a large wooden splinter and finally having his elbow shattered by French round shot. Yet despite this, he kept commanding his ship from the poop deck during the entire fight. This battle within a battle had been captured by painter Nicholas Pocock, who was watching it from the decks of the frigate Pegasus. The French Achille tried to intervene in the fight from the other side, but a furious double-shotted broadside from Brunswick forced her to break off the assault and try to run towards Villaret's flagship. She was eventually run down by HMS Ramillies, who forced her to surrender. The 80-gun Juste and 110-gun Républicaine, wanting to save their flagship, came up on Howe's starboard side. The Queen Charlotte was now fighting on both sides of the ship, although Montagne's capacity to return fire at this point was limited. Shot passed thick everywhere and heavy blocks from the rigging whistled down onto the decks, while yardarms meant to move horizontally partly descended onto the decks like the arms of a giant windmill. Queen Charlotte also received friendly fire from HMS Gibraltar, whose captain Mackenzie was lost in the smoke and her gun crews randomly firing into the chaos. One of the shots, likely stemming from this friendly fire, severely injured the captain of the Queen Charlotte, Sir Andrew Snape Douglas. Meanwhile, the rear of the British fleet was last to engage. HMS Queen, HMS Glory and the rear division's flagship, HMS Royal George, managed to break through the French line, while other ships engaged the French broadside to broadside. HMS Queen, with her makeshift rigging patched up from the previous day's fighting, was quickly dismasted and drifted downwind. Although Howe's fleet failed to break the French line at all points, he nevertheless succeeded in disrupting it, creating a melee in which the British could exploit their superior gunnery and seamanship. Villaret's Montagne, still caught up in the melee with Howe's Queen Charlotte, which he was heavily losing, hoisted more sail and shot forward, joining the fight in the vanguard, with Jacobin following her. Queen Charlotte was at this point too damaged to follow, as her rigging had been ripped apart. She instead closed in on Juste, heavily battering her. The French captains, seeing their line broken, tried to regroup around their admiral, with 11 ships managing to disentangle themselves from the fight and sail towards Villaret. The Montagne and the Jacobin then engaged the British Forward Division's flagship, HMS Royal Sovereign, before engaging HMS Marlborough with great success. All of Marlborough's rigging was shot away and her captain, Berkeley, was severely injured. The beleaguered Marlborough was then towed to safety by the frigate Aquilon. Villaret then cast his eye over the battle to see where next he could influence events. He decided to attack HMS Queen of the British Rear Division, which had been drifting to leeward and had lost most of her rigging. As Queen was made out by most British captains to be in serious trouble, several British ships headed down to her, deflecting Villaret's attack. 2 short lines briefly formed and engaged each other at a distance. After a short while, Villaret abandoned the maneuver and ran downwind. At this stage, the British fleet was unable to pursue because of damage sustained, and 7 unsecured French prizes were floating without masts on the now silent battlefield. At this point, Vainqueur de Peuple, America, Northumberland, Achille, Juste and Impetueux were battered floating wrecks unable to sail or fire, but no formal surrender had occurred. Perhaps because the captains knew that surrender meant death by execution upon return. The silenced French ships were approached by the British asking for surrender, but this was initially refused. Some of them even resisted boarding attempts. The most heavily damaged ship was the Vainqueur, which had been locked in a deadly struggle with the Brunswick. She had multiple holes in her hull below the waterline, and as most of her crew on board were either dead or wounded, there was nobody to repair the shattered pumps, and yet still no surrender occurred. A British officer from the Culloden boarded Wenger, and to his horror he found her filled with splinters, gore and the agonizing cries of the wounded. Initially, no British boat dared to come close to Wenger because other French ships had fired on boats approaching. Precious time was lost as Wenger was taking on more water and her stern slowly started disappearing in the waves. Only after Wenger hoisted a British Union flag on whatever was left of the mainmast, rescue missions could begin. Several British ships sent boats to rescue as many survivors as they could, but this was too little too late. The screeching ship suddenly rightened one last time before she started to rapidly sink by the stern, with a great number of her crew still wounded on board. The other French ships, still floating without prospect of rescue, also finally surrendered, after some back and forth. Villaret disappeared beyond the horizon at 6:15 PM and thus ended one of the most remarkable fights in naval history. The sinking of the Wenger was a very unusual event in the Age of Sail. Ships, when too battered to continue the fight, would usually surrender. Not, however, the French Navy, whipped into almost suicidal determination by Jambon. It is also exemplary of why this battle is considered the most hard-fought battle of the Age of Sail. Contrary to the most famous and covered on YouTube naval battle, the Battle of Trafalgar, the Royal Navy had faced an energetic enemy with almost unbreakable resolve and surprising cohesion. 11 British ships were totally dismasted after the battle. They had also sustained 1,200 killed or wounded. The French fleet lost somewhere around 4,000 killed or wounded and 3,000 captured. With a large portion of his fleet no longer battle-worthy, Howe was unable to resume his search for the French convoy in the Bay of Biscay. The Admiralty had been aware that a battle must have taken place since the arrival of Audacious in Portsmouth, and thus ordered Montagu to keep searching for the convoy. After chasing away a small French squadron off Ushant and blockading it for a night, Montagu himself was chased away by the remnants of Villaret's fleet entering Brest. Howe's main fleet returned to Portsmouth on June 12th, exactly the same day as the convoy from America entered Brest. As the fleets returned home, victory celebrations awaited both. In Britain, the fleet in Spithead was treated with a royal visit from King George III and his entire royal household, with Queen Charlotte visiting the ship bearing her name. Numerous honours were bestowed on the fleet and its commanders. Admiral Howe, already an earl, refused any further elevation, and Howe's political opponents dissuaded King George III from making him a Knight of the Garter. One bitter note, however, stung on the battle as Howe sent a list to the Admiralty of officers he deemed worthy of commendation. The officers excluded from this list were greatly insulted, with Flag Captain later Vice Admiral Collingwood refusing to receive any medals until he was rewarded the Medal of the Glorious 1st of June, which he eventually received after his victory over the Spanish at Cape St. Vincent. Howe had also failed in his strategic mission of intercepting the convoy, which helped the French revolutionary regime to continue the fight against all the other great powers in Europe. Thus, the French claim to victory in this battle is not entirely ungrounded. Villaret was promoted following the battle and led a victory parade from Brest to Paris. The sinking of the Wenger was also immortalized in form of a marble sculptural group titled Le Wenger, which was created in 1908 by Ernest Dubois and now stands in Les Invalides in Paris, next to Napoleon's remains. French propaganda also styled the event as a glorious last stand against an inhumane enemy, when in fact it was the French that day that unnecessarily refused British humanity. This propagandistic and strategic victory, however, didn't save Robespierre and his regime of terror. 2 months after the battle, the tyrant ended up at the blade of his favorite instrument of death. Thank you so much for watching up until this point. I have noticed that most of you don't write any comments, so please, if you got any suggestions of a battle or event I should cover, please let me know in the comments below. Also leave constructive criticism if you didn't like any aspect of the video. With that, again, thank you so much for watching, goodbye and au revoir.